Welcome to the 20th common session of SunoikisisDC Digital Classics 2017. Today we have a session about lexicography, and our guest is Stylianos Chronopoulos from the University of Freiburg. Stylianos, he's an expert of lexicography, and today he will talk about strategies for modeling and annotating information in ancient Greek dictionaries. So, Stylianos, welcome back, because you have been contributing to Sunoikisis since the beginning. And so welcome back to Sunoikisis, and I think you can start now.
Yes, thank you very much, Monica. Hello, everybody. As Monica said, the subject is some strategies about how we can annotate and model lexicographical, ancient Greek lexicographical sources. And I will present mainly two different models, the TEI XML model and the model I am developing right now together with Said Esteban Belmedi and Mark Sivsky, which is based on a graph model or a relational model for representing lexicographical sources. But I will start now sharing my screen, and I will start with a proper presentation. So does it work with the sharing of the screen?
No, not yet. So you should share the whole desktop.
Okay, sorry. Okay. The whole desktop. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah.
Now it should work.
Okay, now I can see your screen and your slides. Okay, I think you can start presenting.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Now the problem is that we see your screen with both slides.
Okay.
So you should exit you should leave the presentation and just show. Yes, because we always have this problem. No, now it works. Perfect. Is working. Okay, excellent.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, the outline of the presentation is the following. I will first give some information about general features of ancient Greek lexica, and then the specific lexicon on which I'm working on, which is for the annotation purposes, which is the lexicon of the Antibautista. I will go on about some general aims of digital encoding of ancient Greek lexica, and then through basic features of the XML TEI dictionaries module. I will treat that in some extent, presenting also examples from a modern printed dictionary. And then we go through the real annotation process I am into. And I will present annotations with the TEI XML TEI model for some entries of the Antibautista, and the same entries annotated with the relational model I'm working on. At the end, we have already some very, very preliminary visualization results, and I will show you these two, so in order to discuss about them. Now, lexica are in general a very complex scholarly supergenre. That means actually under lexica we mean very different genres, several very different genres that have different purposes, and most importantly have very, very different structures on every level. In general, lexica have complex internal structures, and they comprise more than one structural levels. I will show in a minute the most important of these levels. What is very, very interesting for the annotation purposes is that lexica in general comprise a considerable amount of information in their graphical or typographical features. That means that they are not lexically addressed, they are not lexically expressed, but they are represented by certain graphical decisions or typographical decisions. Some more details about these features of the subgenre lexica. First of all, we can see two fundamentally different approaches. There are lexica that start from a word and give its meaning or further information about this word. And it is the most common type of dictionaries. We call them semasiological dictionaries, but the terminology, I have to say that terminology in lexicography is sometimes very, very confusing. Different terms are used to denote the same thing, not peculiarly for lexicography. The other type, the other fundamental different approach is to start from a notion, from a certain thing, object, or abstract notion, and list the words that denote it, structuring these words using a specific pattern or structure. These are lexica that we call normally thesauruses or onomasiological dictionaries. You understand immediately that if we have a genre, a supergenre that has these two totally fundamentally different approaches, the annotation process to devise a common annotation strategy for both of them is extremely difficult, and it is not by chance that the TEI XML dictionary module addresses actually only the first of these dictionaries, lexica, the semasiological dictionaries. We have also a great variety depending on purpose. For example, we have lexica that are monolingual, or we have bi or multilingual dictionaries. We have also dictionaries, for example, of technical terms, but at the same time, we can have thesauruses of technical terms. That means technical terminology of a specific domain is treated in both of them, but it is structured and ordered differently in the two cases. And the last point is that lexica integrate various forms, a great variety of information related to different linguistic levels: the phonology, the morphology, the syntax, and the semantics, and the pragmatics. And in several cases, even now in our highly typified era, they don't do it in a consistent way. I want to explain a little bit more, or talk a little bit more about the structures that we use in order to analyze lexica and dictionaries, because it is important to understand the overall problem of the structuring of a dictionary. First of all, we have the macro structure, which is the overall principle of organization of the material, and two competing methods are used here. The alphabetic organization that started at some point in the 4th century, 3rd century BCE, and became very, very fast, extremely popular. On the other side, the onomastic organization, which was actually older, much older than the alphabetic organization, and still exists, but it is not so popular. The onomastic organization is based really on ideas about how the world is ordered, and it tries to map these ideas of the world structure onto the vocabulary. The most well-known modern example for an onomastic organization, which is used mainly in thesauruses, is the Roget's thesaurus of English words and phrases. The lowest level is the so-called microstructure. We are now in the level of each entry, and we study how its entry is organized. That means mainly which elements are present. For example, phonological information about a word, pragmatic information about a certain phrase, and so on. But also how these elements are ordered. Print dictionaries tend to have a very strict way to organize microstructures, and this is extremely helpful, of course, in order to read and understand and use the dictionaries. I have to say in advance that ancient Greek dictionaries do not have such a structured way to organize microstructure, and this is exactly one of the biggest challenges for the annotation. Ancient Greek lexica now, I want to define exactly the scope of this term. They are lexica that were produced originally between the 3rd century BC and the 5th century CE. That means I exclude later Byzantine lexica, which are many and extremely important since they incorporate material from previous periods. But for now, we will keep it as narrow as possible and talk only about 3rd century to 5th century CE dictionaries. The period from which we have most lexica, ancient Greek lexica, are actually the 2nd century CE to the 5th century CE. They cover different genres. We have semasiological dictionaries. We have a very important onomasiological dictionary, only one. We have lexica of words of a specific genre, and lexica of words or expressions to be avoided or to be used. So lexica with errors, mistakes that you should avoid. These lexica become extremely popular in a period of the 1st to 3rd, 4th century CE. The elite and the scholars turned back to the language of the 5th and the 4th century BCE, and such dictionaries are extremely helpful, well, for people in order to know what they should avoid and how they should speak using the old vocabulary that was not anymore very actual. Several of these lexica are transmitted in epitomized or even heavily epitomized versions. And I have to say something here. We can see epitomized versions, and we should see them as an accident, as a loss of information. And it is true that we have lost a lot of information because of these epitomes. At the same time, epitomized versions are actually an attempt of the epitomator to create something like a database out of a very extended dictionary, to keep the information that he thinks that it is crucial for the purposes of the epitome, and put it in a more or less structured way in order to make usage of the dictionary easier. We will see the examples from the Antibautista that make this point clear. All in all, ancient Greek lexica have several and severe structural inconsistencies. And the most important is that the entries are actually not lists of words structured in a certain way, but linear texts that are meant to be read from beginning to the end and are meant to be understood as a real text. Even in epitomes, where many things are left out, the structures imply that the epitomator is actually thinking in terms of a linear text that is structured. with the proper syntax of an ancient Greek text and not in terms of a list of words. Now, the lexicon of the Antibautista that we are using today as an example is a lexicon of the 2nd century CE. It is transmitted only through one manuscript, the Stylianos 345, and in Bibliotheca Gallica you can find a very good digitized version of this dictionary. It is, as I said already, severely epitomized, and it can be seen really as a database, but it is not a perfect database. There are many inconsistencies, and we will have the chance to see some of them. Its main aim is actually to argue for the extension of the canonical vocabulary. That means that against some people, some scholars, that want to keep the canonical vocabulary, the vocabulary that the elite should use in public speech, as narrow as possible, this lexicon gives arguments to people who want to use a more extended version of ancient Greek vocabulary, providing examples for ancient Greek texts that give some authority to words that other scholars tended to not to recommend. In that respect, the typical entry looks more or less like this. It starts with a head word or a lemma. In our case, it is the phrase "to give a proof," and then the information instead of "to prove." So "to prove" is the narrow canonical term. "To give a proof" is the more extended, something that it is not recommended by others, and then follows the citation. Aristonymos in this comedy. Aristonymos is a comic author of the 5th century, 4th century BCE. Aristonymos in this comedy, Helios Rigon, uses the expression "to give a proof" instead of "to prove." That means you are also, you may also use this expression. Although in general, most of the entries follow this typical scheme, nevertheless, there is variety in the Antibautista, and there is mixture of different structures. In general, when I am thinking, or when we are thinking about digital encoding of ancient Greek lexica, we have in mind these general aims. First of all, we want to encode the ancient texts that are similar in type and function to modern lexica. That means we want to encode ancient texts in a way that shows the similarities, but also the differences to modern lexica. For that respect, we want to apply modern linguistic and lexicographic categories to these ancient texts in order to make them intelligible and to be able to analyze them using these categories and compare them on the basis of these categories. We want, in any case, to annotate both explicit and implicit information in order to enable various types of visualization of the information, connection between different lexica that very, very often have or share similar material, and sometimes exactly the same material, and want to be able to extract quantitative data out of these annotated dictionaries. I have to make, for me at least, an important remark here. While annotating a Greek dictionary, it is important to keep in mind that there is a conflict between representing the original text in its linear structure and representing its deep structure, that means the items and their relationships. This is because, as I said before, ancient Greek lexica are not structured lists of words, but are actually linear texts. And it is very common that the linear structure of the text is not very helpful if we want to represent it, is not very helpful if we think in terms of representing the deep structure and the relationships in the dictionary. That means more or less, do we make an addition, or do we extract information from the dictionary that we annotate and make this or that type of database? We have to always to keep in mind that there is a conflict between these two aims. I go now to some of the basic features of the XML-TEI dictionaries module. I have to say in advance, this is not meant to be, of course, introduction to XML-TEI, and not even a short introduction to that. I take for granted that we have some acquaintance with XML-TEI. If no, never mind, because the logic will be extremely clear. The logic of this module will be extremely clear, and it is exactly this that matters for the purposes of this presentation. So the basic features, I would summarize the basic features of this module as following. First of all, is created to accommodate for structures of printed semasiological dictionaries. Not for printed thesauruses, not for handwritten dictionaries from dictionaries of the pre-modern era. Actually, the module tries to abstract, starting from the best examples of printed semasiological dictionaries that we have, and tries to offer the opportunity to describe them as fully as possible. On the level of the microstructure, which I will focus, the module is based on the assumption that the dictionary consists in a number of clear-cut entries. We know where an entry starts and where an entry ends. And each of these entries starts with a head word, which is also the word that is treated in the entry. Everything else has a certain relation to this head word and is meant to provide information of this or that type for this head word. The main elements are, of course, the entry, the form that is used to annotate the head word, and the sense which is used to annotate various types of semasiological information related to the head word. Of course, there are also other top hierarchical elements. I will not cover it, of course, fully, but in the examples we will see more about this. I've chosen an example of the entry Annotatio in the Oxford Latin Dictionary, and more or less in order to play a little bit around, I give you the first of all the plain form. I have put here the plain form of this entry without any typographical marking. And you see, it is not the easiest thing to read and not the easiest thing to use. If our dictionaries were like that, they would be really very, very, very difficult to use. They are not like that. They are instead something like these, the entry Annotatio in its printed form. And I don't need to say that it's much easier to use. By the way, Oxford Latin Dictionary is one of the best, I would dare to say, examples of lexicography of the last century. Now, we will work with a printed entry, and we will try to see through the structure, the microstructure of the entry. The bold letters mark the start of the entry. At the same time, they give the form, the head word, in its lemma form, in its canonical form. How these forms have been canonized, this is a long issue in lexicography. I need only to say that in the period of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century CE, in Greek and Latin lexicography, this process has already started, but it is still a process. It has not produced its final results. So we see how lexicographers struggle with using lemmata in a very, very typified way. The second very important element, which is also marked typographically with the bold numbers 1, 2, 3, and 1B, 1B, and so on, are the various senses of the dictionary, of the head word. I have to say here that Oxford Latin Dictionary is, of course, a Latin-English dictionary. That means that the sense in this case is in form of a translation, or to put it better, in a form of paraphrase of what the head word means. We have in that respect a kind of definition that is given, but this definition is not in the same language as the head word, but in another language. The third element, also marked typographically, are the cited quotations, the examples of the usage of this head word in its meaning in various Latin texts. It is important to keep in mind that in the printed entry, we have implicit and explicit information. I give only 3 examples. The fact that we have these onis means at the same time not only what the genitive of the word is, but also puts the word in a certain declension paradigm. It tells that the word belongs to the 3rd declension class. The fact that we have this F in italics for feminine implies also the information that this word is a noun, which is not explicitly stated. And we have, on the other hand, the explicit information that the etymology of the word is ad noto plus the suffix tio, and we are supposed to understand that this is the etymological information because it is printed like this. Now I will try to present a way to encode the structure that we see here. As I said, we need, using the TEI XML, the XML TEI module, we have to state explicitly that we have here an entry that starts at some point, and the head word is annotated, encoded in the element form, and then the various senses follow in the structure as they stand in the dictionary. So we have an A1, AA, and AB put in this definition element, in this def element. It's a pretty straightforward way to annotate this entry, and TEI XML addresses such an entry in a very, very good way. We will see also the following examples will show more about that. Since we have a bilingual dictionary here, since the meaning, the sense, is not in the same language as the head word, we can use a different strategy to annotate these. That means, and this is the second annotation, the second sense at the end of the page. We can annotate the information, the writing or making of notes as a citation of the type translation in language English, and then code this note, but put the whole thing in a sense element, indicating in that way that we don't have exactly a definition, but a citation that translates the entry. These are two different ways to address the problem, and of course, both decisions are, in my opinion, okay. I tend to prefer the second, the second decision, in order to make also clear that this is a bilingual dictionary and treat it accordingly. For encoding the cited examples, the TI module offers the SIT element, and in the SIT element, we have the quote element and the bibliographical element that we know also from other modules. We can be as explicit and detailed, so we can play with the granularity here, and I am here, I think, exhaustive, trying to annotate not only the name of the author, to annotate the author, the name of the author, the title, the scope, as separate elements. Now, we will go over and try the same module in order to annotate some of the entries of the lexicon of Antibautista, as I said. First of all, I will read for you the entry, the first entry I've chosen, and try to explain it also a little bit. The head word reads bios. It's a word that has several meanings. In this case, the lexicon, with a very, very short formulation, explains which of these meanings is intended for livelihood, and livelihood here is the meaning of bios. A list of authors or authors and titles of works follows. Herodotus, no work is mentioned. Menander in Demiurgos. Menander is a comic poet. Demiurgos is the title of the comedy. Eupolis in Aeges, the same pattern. And then the poet several times. The poet is always Homer, or most of the times Homer in these sources. And he's very imprecise here, saying several times, but not defining where, which is extremely practical if you are doing an epitome, or even if you're writing the original dictionary, since the only thing you need to indicate is that the authority, Homer, uses this word in these meanings several times. This is good enough for a user who wants to know if he is allowed to use this word in this meaning in public speech. It is not very difficult to use the TEI module in order to annotate this entry. The entry is clear-cut. The form, the head word, is also very, very clear. And then we have a sense that is defined in a specific way, and some citations. In most of them, in all of them, we have an author, and some of the times we have also the title. It is very difficult to use the TEI model, and it's normal, that's like that, to use it in order to annotate several times. I must admit I have no idea how to do that, and I would be very grateful for any hint about this. I find several times very difficult to annotate in this type of annotation scheme. We go over now to a second entry, which is shorter, but a little bit more difficult. The headword reads Argyria, which means more or less money. The remark in the dictionary is in plural, not in singular. And then an author, Platon, which is not the philosopher Plato, but the comic poet Plato, in Cleophon. Cleophon is the comedy. We have here actually a grammatical information about the word Argyria, namely the fact that you are allowed to use the word Argyria in plural and not in singular, as it is the canonical form, and you find an authority supporting this usage, and this authority is Platon, the comic poet Platon, in his comedy Cleophon. We can start trying to annotate this information, this entry in the TI module. The form is clear-cut. It is not exactly a lemma form, it is an inflected form, so we have to give that in any case. And then something that is more or less the usage of this form in specific contexts, and this usage is of the type of grammar. The citation with bibliography, author, and title is okay. For sure, it is very difficult to be sure that the person who sees this annotation understands exactly what this usage element is intended to do in this specific dictionary, lexicon. So you have to make explicit in a preliminary remark that this type of annotation for this specific lexicon means this or that. I go to the third entry now, which is difficult. And it is difficult because we don't have one headword. This happens not very often in the Antibautista, but it happens. The entry reads Anaba, Kataba, Diaba, and Aposta. They are forms of imperatives of the second person singular that are accentuated at a certain point. They all have the same accentuation pattern. The example from Menander's Epikleros that follows, Menander the comic poet, Epikleros is the title of the comedy, actually gives us only one of these forms. It is cited, Horashi, kai frontice, kai aposta brachy, gives only the aposta form. The other forms are there in order to make clear that we have imperatives here. In order to annotate these, I have intuitively used a strategy that defies the principle that we have only one headword that should be addressed, and I have put in the form element the Anaba, the Kataba, the Diaba, and the Aposta, and then simply the citation. It is obvious that this is not the best way to annotate this entry. Many things are remain unclear. It is not clear which relationship exists between these four forms that are all annotated as headwords. And it's also not clear what is the relationship between, for example, Anaba and the citation, the first element, and the citation of Menander. The last example is almost, in my opinion, impossible to annotate in to be annotated in using the TI XML TI module. The entry reads Agalma, which means statue, and graphen, which is the accusative of graphe and means more or less drawing, and andrianta, which is also a statue, trois quarts, or only the head of a man. And then the information added to this is with no semantic differentiation. The author follows the authority Antiphanes in the comedy Zographos. Actually, we should read the entry like this. The three words, agalma, graphe, and andrias, are used by Antiphanes in the comedy Zographos with no semantic differentiation. That means they are treated as absolute synonyms. It is impossible to encode this as one entry with one head word. This is obvious. It is possible, perhaps, to encode it as three different entries. One entry for agalma, one entry for graphe, and one entry for andrianda, and then indicate that the other two words are synonyms to the head word. But it is obvious, I think, that the specific aim of the entry and this very peculiar structure is not at all represented. I have tried to show 4 different examples, starting from an entry that is very well addressed using the XML-TEI dictionaries model, and ending with an entry that, in my opinion, is very difficult to be annotated using this model. And this is one of the reasons why, with the help of Said and Mark, I went over the XML-TEI model to a model that tries to explicitly state lexical items and relations in the entries and encode them in order to let them be represented through graphs. This relational model to encode the Antibautista actually looks for linguistic elements through the text of the entry that denote lexical items, and for linguistic elements, maybe words, it may be also cases, that denote relationships. Of course, I try also to detect and encode implicit relationships, relationships that are not expressed in the text, in the entry. Putting together these lexical items and these relationships leads to create typified sets of lexical items and sets of relations. It is almost an ontology, and I have to admit that this is where I am going to create an ontology in order to describe Antibautista. But I have to say what I will present you today is not the ontology, but the first steps towards it. It is possible, if we annotate the entries like this, it is possible to represent each entry as a graph, and at the end I will show you a very preliminary result. It is also, and this is important, it is also possible to expand this model in order to accommodate for entries from other dictionaries that read similar or the same material. This is really an expandable model that is not under the constraints of annotating only one text, but is really, can really address the difficulties and the challenges that actually that we actually face when we read these dictionaries. That means the fact that they are a network. Now let's go through the entries once more that I presented before. This is the entry bios. which has the meaning livelihood. And this is my experiment with the annotation. The first set with target element, addressing element, author, and works are the lexical items, and then follow the relations between these items. I will go quickly through this entry only in order to explain some things. First of all, the decision here is to use a very well-established in lexicography, well-established distinction between target elements and addressing elements. Dictionaries are understood as a genre where something is addressed by other things. And this something is, in semasiological dictionaries, the head word, but of course, a target element needs not to be unique in an entry. Addressing elements can be of various types, and in this case, we have a concept which is introduced by an article and reads ousias. Ousias is the word livelihood that we find here. What follows are the authors and the works that we see here, with some attempt to normalize and lemmatize and make the references unambiguous. In the part of relations, I try to explain what these for stands for and explicitly annotate it as has meaning. So the target element has the meaning of the addressing element. The next relations are relations connecting the authors and the target element, and the works and the target element as used by, quoted in, but also the authors and the works, is author of. The difficulty with Polakis is addressed here using an attribute frequency, but I have to admit that this is not a very good solution, or I find the solution somehow problematic. I didn't know better, and I have to do some more research on this. The second entry, the entry about Argyria, has its own peculiar difficulties. In that case, we have a lemma, and we have an addressing element that it is of the type remark concerning morphology. The relation I'm using to connect these two things is commented in, which is a very generic relation that appears connecting several different target elements and addressing elements. But if we know what the addressing element is, then we can combine it with the relation and get some meaningful result. What follows is simply the same as in the example we saw before. The third entry, which was really problematic, is addressed using three different target elements. But this structure now allows us to define exactly which element of these four elements is addressed in Menander's citation, in Menander's verse that is cited in the entry. At the same time, I try at the end to produce annotation for the relationship between the four different entries at the, or head words, as is asymptotically connected to. I have to say here that this is not optimal in any case, and I have to work more on the ontology in that respect in order to make it more explicit, make explicit what is the relationship between these 4 different headwords in this entry. In any case, such a model allows to do that in a way that seems natural, and this is exactly what the TI XML model, the XML TI model does not accommodate for. The last entry works again with 3 different target elements, with the author item, and with relations that explicitly state in which relationship the 4 headwords are to each other. Has meaning as, has the same meaning as. In this case, since the fact that has the same meaning as can be found explicitly stated in this adiaphoros, adiaphoros is also annotated in the relation element. What follows is simply the relations between authors and works. I have to say here that some interpretative work is needed here, and of course the decision that I took here, I explain in a second, is open to debate. I think that the entry implies that all 3 words are used by Antiphanes in this specific comedy as synonyms. Perhaps a philologist, another colleague comes, another scholar comes and thinks that only 2 of them, for example, are used in this comedy, but not the 3rd one. But this is my interpretation. I have promised you for the end a graph from the entries or that I have annotated to this point, and there are all entries of A, almost 150 entries. Said has worked and produced a graph that queries for Plato, the philosopher, and presents the result of this object and item and relation annotation in a graph form. And I will now turn to the graph. Monica, do you see it?
Yes, yes, we can see it. Yeah.
So it is a big graph, but I have chosen this presentation in order to be able to zoom in and see what happens. The general picture makes clear how complex some entries are and how simple some other entries are. And we can see alone from this visualization to get a first impression of different types of entries, alone from the fact of the relationships and the items that are here annotated. Plato is in the middle. This is Plato the philosopher is in the middle. This is the query on the basis of which the graph is produced. And a typical entry looks like this. Putting the elements, the items of the entry in named relationships to each other. So the lemma auterapeusia belongs to the entry A0034. The word is used by Plato, the philosopher, who is author of Politeias Gamma, the 3rd book of Politeia, and the word ateropausia is quoted in Politeia's gamma. Pretty straightforward way to represent, I hope, at least to represent the entry. Of course, if entries are more complex, as you see in this case, where in the case of, I bring it in the middle of the entry where Xenophon and Plato appear, we have a higher level of complexity with two authors, two authorities supporting a specific phrase, the usage of a specific phrase, and for both authors, their works are mentioned, so we have a more complex scene. Our aspiration is that producing such annotations for the Antibautista and producing such graphs, and of course the underlying quantitative results, we will be able, at least for these lexicon, to have a more concrete image and at the same time to produce a basis to connect the material of this dictionary with other dictionaries of the same period at least, or later, since, as I already said, the basic feature, I would dare to say, of the dictionaries of this period is that they should not be read in separation to each other, but as a network, discussing, providing and discussing material and debating about it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really very happy for some discussion. Thank you.
Stylianos, thank you. I have to mute you. Okay, there was an echo, sorry. Stylianos, thank you very much. It was great, and especially this graph, of course, was very, very interesting to see the complexity, but so we could see the XML and the graph, so to visualize the complexities of a dictionary, a lexicon, and also the problem of interpreting them. So, questions for Stylianos? Do we have questions in our Hangout? Maybe Stylianos, you can stop the screen sharing. So okay, now we can see you again. Unfortunately, I have to mute you because but now.
But now I want to say something.
Yes,
and
sure.
Lisa asks, well, okay, she thinks it's a very interesting solution, but she asks how many entries do I already have, and how about the time I need to spend for annotating manually all these entries. The dictionary, this dictionary is a small one and has about 1,000 entries. I need for simple entries something between 3 to 5 minutes, because I have to be really concentrated in order not to make a mistake. That can go also faster, I suppose. But for complex entries, to annotate them manually, it's really difficult. Now, I'm sorry that I'm addressing now a very practical problem. After some time, I become tired and I have to stop. So if it was only the 3 or 5 minutes I need per entry, that would be fine. But after having done, let's say, 10 or 15 entries, then I get at least very tired from this type of job. Bottom line, it would be great to find a graphical GUI in order to annotate these, or a program that helps in the task of annotating this. But now I will do it manually.
Stylianos, thank you for this note. So I mute you again because there is the echo. Yes, well, this is practical philology, practical digital philology, and thank you for mentioning this in the sense that we are learning to combine manual and automatic work, and definitely so we have to count how much time we need for annotating something like this, and then, as you said, of course, is tiring, is a difficult effort, also because there is always this difficulty. We have to represent something done by a past author, the author, we can say the author of this dictionary, so the difficulty is to respect the author of the dictionary, the original interpretation, but we always interpret something when we annotate. We can't avoid that. So it's really very, very difficult. So not only for dictionaries, but for many other things. But definitely these problems, this is practical digital philology, which is something that we have always to remind, because this really affects our work, I think. And seeing the graph, which is really very interesting. Also, many questions come out, I think, also about the method for producing these dictionaries, the sources used. So now I'm talking about, well, complex problems, but this is interesting to see, for example, the last example you showed with Plato, but also Xenophon, the two authors, the relations, so how the original author of the dictionary worked, how he read the sources, where he could find them. Did he use other intermediate sources like other dictionaries, other lexica? Of course, these are open questions, but these tools help us. Yes, Stylianos, you have to unmute yourself.
I want also to make a small remark on what you have just said, Monica. I must admit that the reason I started doing this annotation is the wonderful edition of Stefano Valente that we have since some time. And Stefano has done a wonderful job producing a paper, a print edition of this dictionary. First, the fact that this is only a print edition is really painful. You want to use this material, you want to have this material in, thank you, exactly. You want to have this material in a different format in order to be able to interact with it, and you don't. The second fact that I found extremely interesting, that was my, somehow provoked a reaction in me, was that Valente does not care about numbers. For him, is good enough to say, for example, most of the entries are organized like this. How many? He's not interested to say. Or sometimes the epitomator uses this feature. He does not count it. It is not a mistake. Stefano is thinking like a typical classical philologist. Numbers do not matter. The single case does matter. So if you see a single entry and you know that it belongs to the majority of the entries, this is good enough for the single entry. But if you see this dictionary as a whole, or if you want to compare it to other dictionaries, or even worse, if you want to see how often, for example, dictionaries comment upon phonological features of a word, you will find no result. So this was the instance where I thought, well, we need, on the basis of this wonderful edition of Stefano, we need something that will give us the numbers. And this is why I started working on this material.
Yes, I think this is quantitative thinking, and as philologists, we have to learn that. You're right, Stylianos. So this is something that as philologists we are learning, quantitative thinking, so to count these things, these phenomena, and definitely digital philology helps us, I think. So, do we have other questions?
Can I ask a very general question that's not really on the topic you were talking about, but can you imagine once you start to have multiple editions encoded in the careful way that you're talking about, either in TEI or using your ontology, even if incompletely encoded, you may have just 100 entries from one lexicon, some from another, both ancient and modern lexica. Can you imagine these being combined to create a useful reference resource that that draws from multiple lexica in a single entry, a single interface?
Stylianos, you have to unmute yourself because I can't.
This is a very important question. Actually, this should be our aim. We should produce resources that are, from the very start, combinable with other resources on the level of content. Given the variety and the differences of the types of dictionaries and lexica that we have, this can be really difficult. There is some research on this in the last years, and producing such, I have put some references in the GitHub, in the wiki, and the wiki page, and producing such graphs or using this graph approach seems to be more promising than focusing on an annotation of a single source using a specific schema. Even if the models that are used to produce the graphs are not 100% compatible, they can be made compatible. And the information can be combined. Whereas the XML TEI model, I have the impression at least that it aims to annotate what we see without taking into account that something from another source may come and has to be added to that in a specific way. I don't see how XML TEI could address this problem. And this is actually the reason why people are moving now in lexicography, are moving now into this graph lexicon model. It's a difficult question, and we still don't have, as far as I can tell, we still don't have a definite or some definite models in the graph lexica.
Okay, so thank you, Stylianos. Yes, and well, this is a big question, of course, and the big final comment. I think now, okay, so we are perfectly on time. And so I don't know if there are other questions. Otherwise, I have an important announcement for next week, because next week we have a session about historical GIS, but the session will be not on Thursday as usual, but on Friday, June 23 at 5:30 p.m. Central European Summertime, because this session will be a joint session with the Digital Classicist seminar held in London, and our coordinators will be in London for the Digital Classicist seminar. So in any case, I will post this both on GitHub and in our Google Plus community. So remember, next week on Friday at 5:30 Central European Summertime. So I think, well, now we can end the session. Stylianos, thank you very much. It was great because you presented a big, big issues and also a complex problem like lexicography. As usual, you have the class outline in GitHub with the description, with links, and also with the bibliography. So thank you all for this session. Thank you, Stylianos, and see you next week for our next session. So good night and goodbye.